Kraus here with a summary of the nervous system, which is chapter 10, the anatomy portion of the nervous system in first edition of Super Simple Physiology. Nervous system physiology is chapter 22. Second edition, it's all going to be combined. We'll do anatomy and physiology back to back in one chapter, which would be pretty cool. Anyway, let's talk about nervous system. Nervous system, it's a communication system, but it also controls, commands, coordinates, and provides consciousness, awareness for us. Figure 10.1 on page 122, the structural and functional organization of the nervous system. You need to be able to reproduce that, memorization mostly, but understand it. Structurally, the nervous system has two parts, a CNS and a PNS, central nervous system, brain and spinal cord, peripheral nervous system, everything outside of the brain and spinal cord. And the peripheral nervous system is where you have the functional component, as figure 10.1 shows, sensory or motor, and sensory and motor are either somatic or visceral. Motor, visceral, is the autonomic or the ANS, the autonomic nervous system, and it is either sympathetic or parasympathetic. Simplistically, I love figure 10.2 on page 123. Let's make it super simple. The nervous system is about sensory or afferent information going into the processing center, brain and spinal cord. It's integrated, decisions are made, and then efferent or motor impulses going out to effectors, glands, or muscle, and an action is taking place. Need to know the structure of a neuron. Dendrites, soma, axon, hillock, axon. Structural classification of neurons, unipolar, bipolar, multipolar, based on the number of processes from the soma. Functional classification of neurons, afferent or sensory, inter or association neurons that are neurons hooking neurons to neurons. They're the most common functional type. And efferent or motor neurons. And there is, I believe if I can find it, there's a helpful diagram, figure 22.3 on page 238, comparing the structural and functional types, and which are myelinated, which are sensory, which are motor. Take a look at that. Nerves are wrapped just like muscles in a bundle or bundles of three, and the bundles are surrounded by an endoneurium, which is an inner wrapping around individual axons, and then groups of axons form fascicles, just like you have fascicles in skeletal muscles surrounded by a perineurium. And the outer layer around the nerve is the epineurium, dense irregular connective tissue, page 125, figure 10.3. Need to know your neuroglial cells. Neurons transmit impulses. Neuroglial cells support those neurons. And the ratio is about 10-1, neuroglial cells to neurons. So there are about 10 times more neuroglial cells than there are neurons. 6 neuroglial cells, 4 in the CNS, astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, ependymal cells, and microglial cells. 2 neuroglial cells in the PNS, satellite cells, and neurolemmacytes, aka Schwann cells, much more fun to say, Schwann cells. Central nervous system, you need to know the basic brain structure. Frontal lobe, temporal lobe, cerebellum, occipital lobe, parietal lobe, insular lobe, buried deep to the temporal and frontal lobes. Need to know the meninges of the brain. Skull protected, then the brain is surrounded by meninges, an outer tough dura mater that has both a meningeal layer and a periosteal layer right under the skull bone. Then arachnoid mater with a subarachnoid space, under, submarine, underwater, subarachnoid, under the arachnoid. It's got filaments in it, contains delicate web of collagen fibers, so it kind of looks like a spider web. Arachnoids, spiders, that's where the name comes from. This stuff makes sense, guys. When you start to understand that, it becomes much easier and you can minimize your memorization. So subarachnoid space contains ependymal cells, one of those neuroglial cells. Ependymal cells produce CSF, cerebral spinal fluid, and then right on the covering of the brain, a very delicate connective tissue layer of loose areolar connective tissue called the pia mater. Ventricles. Need to know the ventricles. 4 ventricles, left and right. Cerebral ventricles. These are ventricles inside the cerebrum, inside the brain. They are filled with cerebral spinal fluid. 3rd ventricle, cerebral aqueduct connecting the 3rd ventricle with the 4th ventricle that then goes into the central canal of the spinal cord. Cross-section of the spinal cord creates a butterfly-like pattern, figure 10.6 on page 133 in the first edition of Super Simple. Need to know gray matter, white matter. In the brain, it's mostly gray matter on the outside, white matter on the inside. Spinal cord, it's mostly gray matter on the inside, white matter on the outside. Important point that gets tested all the time. So no cross-section of the spinal cord, no the mid-sagittal section of the brain, structured like the corpus callosum, the central sulcus, the precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus, and what those do. Medulla oblongata, pons, midbrain, thalamus, hypothalamus. Go out online and search for an image, graphics of mid-sagittal section of the human brain. And then cranial nerves. And this basically comes down to just some good old-fashioned rote memorization, even though it's super simplified in figure 10.1, an Excel spreadsheet. A lot of info there, a lot of answers to exam questions in here. Spend time with that Excel spreadsheet. You ought to be able to pretty much fill it in from memory. Not pretty much. You ought to be able to fill the whole thing in with memory. 12, and it's always Roman numerals, 12 cranial nerves, the name, the type. Some say merry money, but my brother says big brains matter most. Cranial passage, the target, the action, the uniqueness. Unique things have an increased likelihood of being tested. Clinical test is more physiology than anatomy. But it makes sense. If you want to test cranial nerve 1, olfactory sense of smell, you're going to have the patient smell stuff, see if they can identify certain smells. Vision, you're going to have them look at a Snelling chart, a chart with the big E, the E chart. Need to know the difference between upper and lower motor neurons, and then we get into special senses. But before that, spinal nerves. You need to be aware of spinal nerves. Cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, coccygeal spinal nerves. Cranial nerves originate from the brain, and the brain stem. Spinal nerves originate from the spinal cord. There's one exception to that. Cranial nerve 11, the spinal accessory, has originating fibers from the cervical spinal cord that actually ascend, go superiorly up through the foramen magnum, where they join fibers from the medulla oblongata to form cranial nerve 11, the accessory nerve, and then the accessory nerve exits through the jugular foramen. So a uniqueness there that's very likely to be tested. Know your spinal nerves, and special senses, emphasis on eye and on the ear. Eye is a receptor that changes light waves into visualizations in the occipital lobe of our brain. Know the lacrimal structure, lacrimal gland laterally, and then the lacrimal sac and the nasolacrimal duct, draining tears down into the nasal cavity, the ear, outer ear, middle ear, and there are diagrams, figures 10.7, 10.8, and 10.9 in the first edition of Super Simple. Cochlea is the organ of hearing. The vestibule and the semicircular canals are involved with balance and equilibrium. So some really important functions. So nervous system, really complex system. The brain arguably is the most complex organ. Probably not arguably. I don't know how you could make an argument. The brain is easily the most complex organ in the human body. So chapter 10, nervous system, get her in. I'll see you next time. Kraus out.